Well, you've seen Margaret Evans' reports the last 2 days from South Sudan and the emerging disaster unfolding there. Is there anything we can do about it? Joining us tonight, Samantha Nutt, founder of War Child Canada, Brian Stewart, former CBC foreign correspondent and the journalist who helped bring the devastating 1984 famine in Ethiopia to the world's attention, and Kennedy Jawoko, a journalism professor at Seneca College, who was in South Sudan researching ways journalists cover food security. Their thoughts in a moment, but first, the basics. South Sudan is in northeast Africa, just beside Ethiopia, where 30 years ago, Canadians and the world rallied to save thousands from starvation. The map shows South Sudan's predicament today, the worst hit areas in red. There are 11.3 million people in South Sudan. Almost half of them face hunger today. They simply do not have enough food. 1 million are children. 100,000 are at immediate risk of death. Let me say that again. 100,000 are at immediate risk of death. How has Canada responded? $119 million to affected countries in Northeast Africa, 37 million of that to South Sudan. The UN says more than 40 times that much is needed to avert a humanitarian disaster, and it's needed now. All right, the UN also says this is the first famine anywhere in the world in 6 years. So if you accept that, where do you place the major part of the blame? Is it in climate, or is it the civil war that's going on, especially in South Sudan?
Peter, in this situation, a famine is a catastrophe in slow motion, or at least it starts off as a catastrophe in slow motion, and several things have to go wrong at once. It's kind of the perfect storm. And so in this case, it is the rise of instability, of violence within that part of the world, within the countries that have been affected, but also compounded by climate change, by drought, by economic pressures, inflationary pressures, migration and displacement, that sort of thing. And so all of these things happening at the same time have led us to this unfortunate situation with now 20 million people at risk, which, as you mentioned, the United Nations has declared that to be the largest number of people at risk since World War II. So it's a really critical situation.
So one element needs the others as well for it to develop into this kind of situation.
Exactly. And famine is not something that plagues stable governments in well-functioning democracies.
Brian, any disagreement there?
Absolutely none. And Sam's right to stress the slow motion aspect of that. We've had years of a build-up towards a catastrophe, not just in South Sudan, but in the other countries mentioned, in Yemen, in Somalia, in northern East Nigeria. You know, it's there. There's also, besides the violence, which I put down as primary, the poor governance, which is in many cases no governance at all, but also economic catastrophe of enormous level. I mean, the death of so many commodities, the slow depression that befell the commodity market, basically left so many countries in Africa with poor exchange rates. They had to pay more money to bring food in. Inflation in parts of South Sudan, I think, is hitting 800% a year. How can the poor, how can the basically homeless, subsistence farmers possibly survive?
Kennedy, you've been there. You've studied this situation. There's been a civil war there now for 3 years. A lot of blame is being placed on the government in Sudan, South Sudan, in allowing this to unfold the way it is. Is that fair to place that blame?
I think that's a very fair, assessment from a lot of international aid organizations, but also the United Nations and other South Sudanese watchers as well. I think what's happening is that people are running out from the brink of genocide into the arms of famine. And that is partly to do with the collapse of good leadership. There is a very, when I first went to South Sudan in 2011, right after independence, we already saw the cracks of poor leadership and the joking of who wanted to lead the country between the two protagonists, the two men, Salva Kiir, who is the president right now, and his vice president, Riek Machar. And that continued. So, famine is not something that happens, just like Samantha said, in well-established democracies. So the reason it's happening in South Sudan is because I think the institutions are non-existent. We concentrated as an international community, even in East Africa, to build a state, the notion of statecraft. And we forgot the fundamental issues that were there, and building the capacity of those leaders to make informed, engaged, meaningful decisions that's going to lift up the standard of their people. Otherwise, we wouldn't be seeing what's unfolding right now in that country.
Sam, you've got a team there now. What are they telling you?
Well, I would certainly agree with that. And I would add to that on top of the government in many instances being implicated in this violence and in some of the atrocities that are taking place, and including things like recruitment of child soldiers, for example, rape and abuse of women. And in addition to those accusations, this is a government that also has impeded aid efforts, humanitarian efforts, at pretty much every turn. And so it is making it extremely difficult for aid organizations such as War Child and many others that are on the ground to just do our jobs. If we were able to get access to populations in need, if we were able to ensure that farmers had the tools and the inputs that they needed to be able to farm the land, to be able to provide for themselves and provide for their families. I mean, it's like it's this massive storm that's coming your way, and you know it's going to hit, and you know it's going to be absolutely devastating. And unfortunately, despite all of the alarm bells that are going off, you can feel absolutely powerless to do anything about it. And that's something that every aid organization on the ground in South Sudan right now is facing.
And powerless in some ways to get the message out of what's happening there. I mean, I had Stephanie Genzer, Margaret Evans' producer, talking to me on the weekend, and Richard Devey, the cameraman, saying what they'd just witnessed and what they'd seen. It reminded me of the talks we used to have when you were in Ethiopia. Had to be brought to the attention of the world. The question is, who's listening? I mean, the UN says they need $4.5 billion to confront this situation. They're nowhere near that. No. And they can't seem to get anyone to listen. Here's the real scary thing about it that's been worrying me for many years now. I think we're in a phase in the world where the vortex of ever-increasing news stories and crises and real crises and of corruption and conflict is simply overwhelming. It's overwhelming, in many cases, governments and the overwhelming aid agencies. It's overwhelming the media. And I think it's starting to overwhelm the attention spans of everybody. Every week we're hearing new crises. And the other thing is, at this time of big stories and crises, everybody's got their own parochial concerns now. In North America, elections, the Trump phenomena. In Europe, elections, the refugee crisis, counterterrorism. All of these are taking up more and more of the attention of the world, and it's distracting attention from a crisis that is so vast that 20 million people are at risk of death through famine, malnutrition, and disease. And basically, it's just one more sound up there in the ether that people aren't hearing clearly, and it's just getting worse and worse. And I don't know yet what the answer to it is. Kennedy, how do you feel about that?
I think the answer, if I may, could also be in looking at, how South Sudanese journalists are telling their own stories as well. Mm-hmm. So with the work that I did starting in 2013, I went to South Sudan with the support of John Hondrick of the Toronto Star. Mm-hmm. And he funded my trip there to conduct this research to look at food security issues. And I came back with a report. I've developed a prototype that allows for some kind of a mechanism to effectively report on food security issues and hunger and famine and all the, the evils that were unfolding in South Sudan. And so what I found there was that a lot of young South Sudanese journalists want to tell their stories. They want to get their stories out. And they have tapped into, some of them have tapped into the new wave of, digital liberation tools, Twitter, Facebook, and all the, WhatsApp, and all the gadgets, the tools that we have. And that in some ways is getting the stories out, but it's not really reaching, I believe, the ears that are supposed to make those critical decisions, whether it's in Ottawa or in Washington or London, Paris, all these major Western cities that need to hear what's going on in South Sudan. So training South Sudanese journalists is going to be critical to the gap that we have right now in terms of the disconnect, if you like, between the stories that are getting out and what is being received in Western capitals.
Sam?
I certainly agree with that, and I think it is going to take a monumental global political effort to react to this crisis. And when do we reach the tipping point on that? It would seem to be that early warnings are not sufficient. We know 100,000 children are immediately at risk. We know millions more are at serious risk, serious threat in terms of their health and well-being. Are we going to have to get to another situation like the Ethiopian famine, where the images are so overwhelming and incontrovertible that we are compelled to do the right thing as an international community? Famine is preventable, and it's often this kind of patchworky approach that can, in some instances, and this over-reliance on food aid and that kind of thing that doesn't take a long-term view of these challenges, that can inadvertently, unfortunately, make it worse.
You know, 30 years ago, over 30 years ago, we knew that those images in Ethiopia of dying children and just ghastly images, we knew that if the world waited to see things like that again, it would be far too late, because when a famine strikes, it's already a massive failure. You can rush in and try and help a famine, but basically when they're dying in those numbers, people have reacted too late. I think also today there's a numbing of the visual aspect. We see so many catastrophes, so many corpses over the years. The other thing is, I think there is something I call deadly defeatism. I think countries are getting weary of struggles that don't seem to end.
That's so depressing, though.
It is. Well, it's not only depressing, it's incredibly dangerous. We can't allow defeatism to take hold. But, you know, many of these countries have been basically failed states. There are 50 failing and failed states in the world. Many of them in failed states now for 20, 30 years. And when Europeans or North Americans look and see no real crisis coming back again, they start to feel defeatist, that they can really affect change all that much. That's a disastrous point of view.
You know, Ethiopia proved that this theory isn't always the case, but there is the belief by some that when it's Africa and we're talking about these kind of situations, that you can't raise the money aid, you can't raise the food aid, and you can't raise awareness of governments. You were working in Africa all the time.
Yeah,
is that the case?
I've been working on these kinds of issues and going in and out of Africa, certainly war zones, for the last 25 years. And I started in Somalia during the famine, and here we are 25 years later facing a similar situation. And it is intensely frustrating. But I actually genuinely believe that if we can mobilize public attention, if we can get governments to take notice, if we can be smart about the early warning system and what kinds of interventions work, if governments are willing to respond, if individual Canadians are willing to respond, that alternatives do exist and that we actually can find a way through this. But it takes diplomatic effort and energy, it takes financial effort and energy, and it takes a public commitment to engaging and a sense of social responsibility around that. And I do think Canadians are generous when it comes to that, but sometimes it takes encouragement, and being on the ground and helping to report on it makes a big difference there.
I've only got 30 seconds left. Kennedy, give us the closing thought here.
I strongly believe that the international community has the responsibility to protect South Sudanese citizens from famine and this barbarity that is going on in the context of civilians being killed indiscriminately. And Canada has a role here, not just a moral obligation, but also a self-interest obligation to intervene in South Sudan. Whether, I don't know how what shape it's gonna take, but I think there needs to be some clear message coming out from Ottawa.
All right, I thank you all. Good discussion, and I'm sure we'll have more of them in the next little while.